What are we reading today? We are reading the chapter, the Embodied Cognition handbook chapter on the embodiment of attention in the perception action loop. This chapter describes a series of examples of where the computer metaphor of the mind breaks down, with a special emphasis on attention, and points to an embodied and situated account of mind that can naturally accommodate those problematic phenomena that undermine the computer metaphor. All right, rather than proposing the next new metaphor for the mind, we instead encourage drawing eclectic inspiration from embodied cognition to appreciate how the body itself performs some cognitive operations. We pull from ecological psychology to appreciate how the relation between organism and environment produces cognition, and dynamical systems theory to carry out analog information processing simulations, and cognitive neuroscience to stay grounded with the real physical material that lies at the hub of cognitive phenomena. These types of findings all led to treating visual search as belonging on a continuum of efficiency rather than being implemented by either a pre-attentive parallel filtering mechanism or an attentive serial filtering mechanism. As the passive feed-forward filter approach to visual attention failed to account for new findings, it made room for a more proactive, goal-oriented approach to attention, rather than the emphasis being... So I think there was this heavily perception-oriented notion of attention that we're specifically moving like a spotlight around and we're seeing what's inside the spotlight. This is now pointing out the change towards a more robust view of a much more active form of attention, goal-oriented as well. All right, rather than the emphasis being on how perceptual systems convert stimuli into interpretations, a new emphasis was building on how attention results from motor systems making real-time demands on what sensory input is needed or expected next. So this is active inference in its finest, like literally active inference by definition. What do we have? We have interactive models of attention. This more proactive approach to attention raises the question, where in this goal-oriented account of attention do the goals come from? They proposed a neurally inspired account of visual attention in which neural representations of objects, in other words, Hebbian cell assemblies or population codes, compete against one another in parallel for the privilege of eliciting their associated motor output, such as an eye movement or a reaching movement. So this is kind of a global workspace theory idea, except that we're not talking about consciousness here. We're talking about how the competition is for broadcast, but not necessarily for conscious broadcast, even though it ends up being conscious broadcast. You know, consciousness is just a manifestation of this broadcast system, but the broadcast system is much more fundamental. And this broadcast system allows this signal to reach other parts of the brain, which allows further propagation. That's the whole idea of complexity and integration, the information actually propagating across the entire network. Okay, neural feedback projections from frontal brain regions to visual brain regions can then bias this competition process based on goals and other information from other sensory sources. So this is literally this is once again a predictive processing view of how the selection process happens. It's heavily affected by priors. This biased competition account of attention has been extremely influential and naturally makes a number of empirical predictions that have indeed been reported in the experimental literature. For example, when a visual stimulus is especially relevant for the goals of a visuomotor task, single cell recording in monkeys show that neurons responsive to that stimulus exhibit a higher firing rate than when that same visual stimulus is presented to that receptive field but is irrelevant to the task. So rather than thinking about like there being a task and now you're filtering something differently because the task, your brain is expecting something related to what you're trying to do, and therefore it can obviously affect this type of difference of activation. Moreover, fMRI results with humans showing that when a tactile pre-cue is spatially congruent with a visual stimulus, activation in visual cortex for that visual stimulus is greater than when the tactile pre-cue is spatially incongruent. I don't know quite what that means. Visual input of a face can trick the process of speech recognition into perceiving a spoken syllable one way or another. Auditory input can, this is another sense where you would imagine that visual input has now affected your priors in some sort. Okay, and spoken linguistic input can make a conjunction search process function as though it were a parallel process, uninfluenced by the number of distractors. Okay, I don't know what that means either. In sharp contrast to Fodor's proposal of sensory systems as informationally encapsulated modules, these kinds of findings support a radically interactive and distributed account of attention, where even purportedly unimodal perceptual systems are being biased by other modalities. So, yeah, it's not just the case that our eyes are just like scanning like visual input and we're taking it in and we're just putting it through this filter. It's that everything about what we believe that we're seeing right now is being first pre-biased by these top-down predictive priors. Okay, cascaded models of attention. Even if every subsystem is influencing practically every other subsystem, this leaves open the question of how immediately those influences are transmitted. Traditional stage-based accounts of processing function by having each stage complete its operations before then passing out an output to the next stage. This is quite different. So yeah, traditional stage-based accounts, you do that. It's like multiple filters. It's like you put all these filters through, or put whatever input, whatever perceptive input, sense data, whatever it is, just put it through a bunch of filters. But this is quite different from a type of system that functions on partial, fuzzy, incomplete, and distributed information that is constantly in flux, which is really what our brain's doing. It may feel counterintuitive to think of attention as something this diffuse and partial, rather than it being narrow and directed. But many studies have shown that we operate as best we can with a constant flow of partial bits and pieces of information. Over the course of a few hundred milliseconds, the continuous accrual of perceptual information in visual brain areas was constantly cascading into oculomotor brain areas to contribute to the gradual development of an eye movement command. That's how pervasive this idea of competing drives. You could consider that all leading to this gradual development of an eye movement command. All right, when microstimulation then triggered the evoked saccade in a neutral direction, some portion of that still developing voluntary response was also active in the frontal eye fields, of course. All right, the resulting movement was a weighted average of the evoked neutral saccade and the partially accrued command for the voluntary response saccade. Clearly, the motor system is not patiently waiting to be delivered a completed command from the cognitive system, but is instead continuously participating in the development of the understanding of what a stimulus means for that organism, thus blurring the line between what is motor and what is cognitive. All right. This kind of partial processing can be found in many decision-making tasks where information can cascade through the system even without subjective awareness. Of course, a lot of this is happening without subjective awareness. Okay, they trained participants to rapidly identify whether an animal or means of transportation was present in a picture displayed for a mere 20 milliseconds on the screen and then masked. Animal and transportation trials occurred in separate blocks, and responses were made via a go, no-go paradigm. Participants were extremely accurate in this task in identifying whether those objects were present or not. An initial interpretation of this result might be that in a mere 20 millisecond of input, the feed-forward sweep of sensory information appears to be enough to carry out visual object identification in a seemingly context-free manner, before frontal brain regions would have time to respond and send feedback to visual areas. Okay, so yeah, participants were quite accurate when they were only given 20 milliseconds to identify whether an animal or means of transportation was present in the picture. However, this neglects the fact that the task of identifying a pre-specified object's presence or absence is itself a goal-oriented task. Goals are driven by frontal and prefrontal cortex, which has feedback connections to visual cortex. What is likely happening in this scenario then is not a context-free feed-forward sweep whereby some particular category is rapidly identified, but rather the goal of looking for this target even before a stimulus is presented involves feedback signals from the frontal regions, tuning those visual receptive fields to temporarily become car detectors or animal detectors, focusing processing on features that are associated with those categories. What then directs where attention goes if it works in this radically distributed interactive fashion? If we have a system that cascades its information from subsystem to subsystem so promiscuously that we lose track of which signals are feed forward and which are feedback, can we still have something coherent enough to be called attention? Rather than conceiving of attention as a spotlight directed by a central executive, a more scientifically sound approach may be to conceive of attention as the emergent result of biased competition among multiple partially active representations. This is exactly what we got with the global workspace theory when we were looking into consciousness. Rather than assuming that the focus of mental activity at any one point in time somehow derives from one source, like the central processing unit of a computer, perhaps it instead derives from myriad sources. Some of these sources are goals and biases from neighboring neural subsystems. Some of them are biases from immediately perceivable environmental constraints. Some of them are biases from signals delivered by other people in the environment. At longer timescales, some of these biases are social norms and cultural constraints. At even longer timescales, some of these sources are evolutionary influences. The density of perceptual acuity at a particular moment in time, the sense of who we are and what we're about at that moment, is something that emerges non-linearly out of the complex interactions among innumerable informational biases competing and cooperating in real time. All right, this is nothing new to what I usually speak about, but it's still really cool to hear someone say it. Cascaded interaction spreads, with different sensory, cognitive, and motor systems continuously biasing one another in real time. There is no point in time during which a given subsystem is processing its input in a context-free manner. Right, if everyone's plugged into the global workspace, there's no context-free processing. Everyone's already biased by other information that's already in that global broadcast. There will always have been some form of contextual bias that was busy influencing the given subsystem immediately before some new afferent sensory input enters it. If continuous, distributed interactions between sensory systems make vision no longer an encapsulated module and audition no longer an encapsulated module, is this how you use audition to describe like audio or audial signals? Audition no longer an encapsulated module, then continuous distributed interactions among cognitive processes and motor processes make cognition no longer a module that is separate from action, hence embodied cognition. In fact, given the millisecond timescale at which various motor movements continuously update the sensory input, which continuously updates cognitive processes, which continuously update the ongoing motor command, perhaps these external actions themselves may not even be informationally encapsulated from cognition. This lends itself to the idea that our movements, both at the level, the intuitive level of our attention, as well as the level of our motor movements, is a means of thinking in some sense. These processes are all involved. And I guess, how do we make this intuitive? Obviously when people talk, they use their hand movements, and that helps themselves. Not only, it's not just for communication, but it helps themselves get in the spirit in some sense. And then what else? What I'm doing right now, where I looked up to think about this thing, or I looked to the side to think about something. You can imagine that attention shift is actually helping me in some sense. I'm looking to something maybe that's really boring. Maybe that's why. Maybe it's as long as I look away, you see this when people are talking to each other, especially I feel like this is even more so the case when you're introverted, and you might get a lot of not necessarily stress, but it's very cognitively demanding to have to deal with social norms in the moment, right? You have to be on when you're when you're looking at someone. You have to take in all these signals. So when you're trying to think about what you're trying to say, maybe it's good to look away at something that isn't that stimulating, especially not as stimulating as another person's face. And then that allows you to think about the thing. Then you obviously want to look back to make sure that you get the feedback. But that's the type of way we can think about this. Okay, that's my guess, by the way. I'd imagine we could figure that one out. Yeah, is that not what we're doing right now? This is why we're optimally thinking right now. We don't have to deal with each other's facial feedback in some sense. Okay, skeletal motor movements are a useful way to perform cognitive operations such as pressing keys on an interactive computer interface. But there is a far more ubiquitous motor movement happening about 3 times per second that performs cognitive operations during your entire waking life, no matter where you are or what you're doing. Eye movement. These people demonstrated that a given eye fixation can function like a pointer in a content addressable computer memory. Oh, okay. A pointer, as in it points to where the actual value is. It's basically like a memory address. That's what the pointer is. So rather than forming neural representations of complex visual objects in memory while viewing a scene, people often simply maintain spatial locations in memory and send the eyes to those locations to access the content in those addresses. Whoa, okay, is that what we're doing when we look away? What is going on here? Essentially, people exhibit a stronger tendency to use one's environment as an external memory store. Okay, wow, that's incredible. You could think of it like the pointer, but you could also think of it like using some motor movement as a stimulus to find the thing that's associated with that stimulus. And you'd have to have something that tells you what the eye location would be that would tell you about this other. So it's like pointers of pointers of pointers. This is like, maps of maps of maps. Okay. Thus, on the time scale of a few hundred milliseconds, eye movements are changing how the environment impacts your sensors, which changes how you cognize your environment, which changes the next eye movement, which changes the next sensory input, and so on. This is a recurrent causal loop that cannot be unraveled to find the chicken versus the egg. Half of the data transformations that constitute an organism's attention are actually happening outside the body, and how the body's movements have altered how light projects onto the retinas. So much so that one could be tempted to suggest that much of your visual experience is itself happening in the space around you rather than solely inside your brain. Okay, what are we talking about here? Eye movements in the perception action loop. In this way, not only are eye movements highly useful for the experimenter as a record of what is drawing attention at any moment, but they are also highly useful for the organism itself. A different pattern of eye movements on the same scene will not only reveal different thought processes about the environment, it can cause a different thought process about the environment. For example, just as recording eye movements during mechanical problem solving has provided a deeper understanding of mechanical reasoning, it has also provided inspiration for improvements of training with technical devices. Even high-level conceptual insights can be jump-started or missed entirely by different eye movement patterns on a diagram associated with an insight problem. People who are 30 seconds away from solving a diagram-based version of Dunker's famous tumor and lasers radiation problem, that's what was discussed up here actually, tend to make a characteristic pattern of eye movements on the diagram. Those who are 30 seconds away from giving up on the problem exhibit less of that eye movement pattern. Interestingly, this pattern of eye movements was not merely an indicator to the experimenters that a person was about to solve the problem, but that pattern of eye movements was actually assisting the person in arriving at the solution. In their second experiment, Grant and Spivey subtly animated the diagram in a way that unconsciously induced that pattern of eye movements, and it doubled the proportion of people solving the problem. All right, the embodiment of attention. Okay, so this is the summary, so we can just read it all. Cognitive science has a long history of drawing inspiration from the computer metaphor of the mind and placing the bulk of its emphasis on how external stimuli influence mental processing, but this is only one half of the story. The other half, of equal importance, is how mental processing influences external stimuli. When attention gets physically embodied in motor movements, even subtle and brief ones like eye movements and other muscle twitches, those movements change the way the environment impacts our sensors in ways that abide by continuous physical laws. The result is that while the environment is catalyzing events in the brain is simultaneously catalyzing events in the environment. motor movements, for example. This auto-catalytic loop, where the brain and the environment produce an emergent phenomenon called cognition, steers our understanding of the mind away from the formal logical computer metaphor, where genuine autocatalysis is not logically possible. And it is radically changing how we conceptualize joint action when two people are sharing an environment and intermingling their perception-action loops. That was discussed in the previous chapter, but we'll do that when we go into the topic of social dynamics. If we acknowledge that attention in particular and the mind in general is an emergent property of an embodied brain interacting with its environment, then the future of cognitive science will require a complex dynamical systems approach to cognition, drawing insights from embodied cognition, ecological psychology, complexity theory, computational neuroscience, and robotics. All right, I think we're gonna chill now.